had originally intended to write a lovely, well-worded blog post about Beltane earth energies, but the more I tried to write it, the more I wasn't getting what I really felt and meant and see in Beltane across. So in the end, I've thrown the piece of paper out, scrapped the typing, and decided to do a video instead. So Beltane is coming up this weekend, and I became fascinated by the Celtic Wheel of Time when I moved to Ireland at the age of 9. And it became instantly clear that the Irish way of life in the 1970s was very different from the 1970s England that I had moved to. It was still very, I'll use the word superstitious, but it carried with it still many pagan undertones wrapped up in this Catholic country. And I became fascinated by the Beltane fires, by all these things and all this mythology in the landscape that really replicate how energy moves through time and space. In modern society, we have this concept of time as very linear, past, present, and future. But actually, time moves in cycles. We go round this solar year, spring, winter, summer, autumn. We go round it perpetually in life. We have the lunar phases that go from new moon to full moon to back to new moon, lunations that last a month. So within the solar year, we do this big circle, and then we do these lunations of the lunar cycles throughout this year. And we are in these phases of birth, life, and death, of ideas and relationships and phases through our whole life. And we can be in different points of this wheel of time in different aspects of our life. So if we look at, where you are in age, you might find that you're in midsummer, you're halfway through your life, you've reached your peak, and it's all downhill from there. You also might find that in your life, you're in the emerging stage of a relationship. It's all new and it's all exciting, and it's just starting to take shape like an inbolt. It has all this promise behind it. In other aspects of your life, you may find that it's time to let things go. You're in Samhain. What do I want to take with me into this next phase of learning, but what's not relevant for me? So throughout my life and in my business, I use the wheel of time in understanding where I am, because that really helps me to understand what's coming next, particularly in business, because we can find ourselves especially when we're learning and growing and developing, it's sort of like barren periods, no clients, no nothing, panic, no money, and we're really in the winter solstice, then the dark night of the soul, where we can't yet see what wants to emerge. At that point in time in our business life, we're often trying everything, strategy, we're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. But sometimes it's a case of being patient, allowing the soul of your business to encourage you to see things to emerge, that want to emerge, things that you may not have yet thought of, may not be able to conceptualize. So the wheel of time is quite important for me in terms of my whole life, particularly because I've always been able to see earth energies and these changes. So what is Beltane, for those of you who are not familiar with it? Well, Beltane is the cross-quarter day that marks the midpoint in spring. So we start spring and then we head over to summer, and it's this midpoint. It's at the pregnantness, it's when spring is at its most pregnant, and everything. Then we're going into this stage of then everything's starting to go out of bloom and be fertilized, and then later in the year, of course, we will reap the harvest, the abundance, and we will go into that gathering stage, going into the darkness and, eating, quaffing in the darkness before we think, oh God, I'm ready to come out of winter. When's the spring coming? So it's this halfway point between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. Now, in the middle of the season, there is a clear difference in energy compared to the beginning or at the end. But these shifts are subtle. It's not like winter starts on one day and spring starts on the next. There is these transitionary periods. So the equinox and the solstices and the cross-quarter days, they all mark these transitionary periods. Now, the equinoxes and the solstices are what we call exoteric events because they're easy to see. The winter solstice, smallest hours of daylight, longest hours of night. Summer solstice, longest hours of daylight, smallest hours of night. Equinoxes, equal day and night, exactly split down the middle. But the cross-quarter days are more subtle. They're what we call an esoteric event. Now they happen because of the sun moves at 15 degrees into the fixed astronomical sign of Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aries, but we can't actually see that. And it only occurs, lots of complicated astronomical calculations going into working out where it is. So we have a fixed day around these things, and it tends to be 1st of February for Imbolc, 1st of May for Beltane, 31st of August for Lammas, and the 31st of October for Samhain, or Halloween, as many people know it. So it's a way of marking the evidence as the energy shifts around this wheel. So the day is now getting noticeably longer. The sun sets much later than it did at the spring equinox. It's grown considerably warmer outside. Everything is growing. Things are blooming. Birds are mating. It's all full of this exotic dance between the masculine and feminine that gives this creative generative force that's going to give birth to all this new life that's going to see us through the winter again. So it's a really potent time, and it was always one of my favorite times when I was a kid. When I moved to Ireland, I was very fortunate to move, as I say, we moved places that are important to us, but for learnings we have to have at that particular time of year. So when I first moved to Ireland, we moved to a crofter's cottage in the middle of bloody nowhere. No running water, nothing. We had a well put in, and that's where I first came into contact with water dowsing. And it fascinated me because I could already see this energy, but I hadn't really told anybody about it. And I could see this water diviner following these paths of energy that I could see above ground, waving and shimmering. Thought, that must be water. But I didn't know what it was because I'd never, at the age of 9, you can't dig a big well and find out what it is. So I realised that must be water. So I then started to develop a kind of a language that enabled me to understand what all these different energy phenomena were. That I saw these serpentine lines of energy across the landscape, like dragons, dragon lines, some of them huge, and they seem to be connected to, as I grew older, realised they were connected to the solar year. There are other paired lines that are twins, and they're connected to moon phases. There are lines that come out of hills that do these massive hoops right up in the stratosphere and come down again. They have these pulsing donuts or toroids of energy that pulse up them at certain rates that change with the different seasons. There are lines of energy that come out of, go from sort of like volcanoes, whether they're active or not, to geological fault lines. There are waves of energy that come out of geological fault lines and go almost like a lapping wave up the hillside, or a slow moving wave up the hillside, probably just about walking pace. And this is almost like water. It ripples into hollows in the ground, and the old ditches and bank structures, if they're built next to a geological fault line, capture this energy, and it forms like pools within the ditches and bank structures. So there's lots of things that were going on. So, but I became fascinated by Bealtaine. I would spend hours around that period watching these energies occur. And particularly on Bealtaine itself, there are certain things that literally erupt when this astronomical event takes place. And this year, in the Northern Hemisphere, astronomical Bealtaine, I believe, I'll have to double check, is on the 5th of May, and I think it's 14:25 or something in the afternoon when the sun reaches that 15 degrees. So Bealtaine, it comes from the Celtic world's sort of bright fire. Yeah, is the roughly speaking English translation. So Irish Gaelic for bright fire. And it's at this time that the Gaelic Celts, really started celebrating the beginning of summer. Fire was incredibly important. They lit fires. They moved cows through fire, lines of fire through the smoke. It was cleansing, celebrating the livestock that survived the winter, that had been healthy enough to get through, which we could then breed from, to create more food to get through next winter. So there was a lot. There were these huge gatherings for, feasting, merriment, and everything else that goes on when you have too much food and drink, to, create new life moving forward. And this was also mirrored. It's mirrored in the energy in the landscape, as I say. So now in midwinter, the solar lines tend to shrink. They're at their narrowest. and they begin to expand to midsummer, and then they shift back to midwinter again. So there are big lines that are doing this in terms of their width. Moon lines often shift about in pairs through the lunar phases, so they move around also, but they don't expand, they just sort of move. But interesting enough, it's when I first moved to Ireland, I'll get there in a minute. I moved to a crofter's cottage in the middle of nowhere. And it was there that I first really made contact with what the Irish call the She, which are the fairy folk. And that was because I used to spend hours wandering over fields and sitting in trees all by myself. And I'd always been able to see energy. But I became fascinated in the Irish landscape because I could see so much more than I could from my country of birth, which is England. I come from an Irish family, by the way. Because of activity and cars and this was late 1970s, so nothing like what it is today. But there wasn't the level of interference, and I lived literally in the middle of nowhere, could walk for hours, used to climb massive trees. Big elm tree that I still had that was one of my favourites. Unfortunately, it did succumb to Dutch elm disease, bless it, eventually. And I used to spend hours lying in these trees, and that was the first house, and that got me in a communication with the fairy folk. They would orbs of light and different things would come down, land, and it enabled me to have out-of-body experiences. They took me into I won't say other dimensions, because everything, I believe, exists in the one dimension. It's just that we have a certain threshold of awareness within that, like on the colour spectrum. So, there are colours that we can't see, infrared and ultraviolet, but they still exist in the here around us. And I think a lot of this other energy phenomena exists here around us all the time. It's just that our sensitivity to it is narrow. Most people's wavelength is narrow. For some reason, I can see it and feel it and hear it and sense it and touch it and get electric shocks off it and all sorts of things. So there's definite electromagnetic quality to some of this energy. And then I moved to another house, and I moved near a place called Crook Bealtaine Hill. And it instantly became apparent as I developed this huge relationship with this hill, like a giant in the landscape, that there was a lot to learn from that hill. And I spent ages watching the energy phenomena around this hill change from day to day through the seasons for the years that I lived there. And it became very apparent why it was called Crook Bealtaine. So if you live anywhere that has an association with Bealtaine, Bealtaine Hill, Bealtaine something, make sure you visit it in the day. Because there are the Crook Bealtaine where I lived, there was this, at that time, it would erupt with energy like a volcano. So there were some crossing energy lines on the top, and they form like these pictogram structures. And it became very fractal-like, but it's like a 3D fractal. So it's this huge pulsing, throbbing fractal on top of the hill of the most complex energy structures on May Day. And then out of this huge column of energy would rise up, right up into the stratosphere. I couldn't even see where it came down, if it did at all. These things are astronomically big. And then every so often you'd get this pulsing donut energy go boof, and he'd wait another while, and another one would go boof, like a smoke ring that would go up around this column. And I would sit in this energy, probably not very wisely, but I would have the most amazing out-of-body experiences. I'd be able to do psychometry, see the landscape. But it was just the most incredible feeling. But there are fast-moving and transitory energy phenomena that occur in the landscape at these times. I think when we're dowsing, getting sensitive to energy, we often think of these things as fairly static. But there's an awful lot of moving energy. So there will be things that look like 3D checkerboard grids that will float across the surface of the ground with different numbers of squares within them. Sometimes they will be on the vertical, sometimes they will be on horizontal. You will get toroids of energy coming up these columns. Sometimes they will shoot down an energy lay, a solar line. Sometimes, again, these big toroids, these big donuts will free float across the landscape. And the other thing that we got, and this was what used to flummox me more than anything else. I could understand all the energy phenomena because it was very geometrical. You could talk about pentagons or dodecahedrons and all these geometrical shapes. That seems fine. But there were these other phenomena that obviously where myth and legend were become based upon. These like line art drawings would erupt from certain hills when their key, the name that they're associated with particular times of year would happen. So at Crook Beltane, these line drawings, they're like, they come out as an energy line. It's a single uniform uni line, a bit like the Nazca lines. You know, it's one single path that forms a giant spider. You would get these line drawings come out of these hillsides, and they would like come out, erupt out in like a jumble, and then they would form these lines. So these giant figures would erupt out of Crook Beltane. Rather bizarrely, they had very short bodies and very long legs that are in bell-bottom trousers. And they would stride across the landscape in these huge strides, like lying flat on the ground. And then these like dwarf-like figures as well would come tumbling and roll down the hillside. And particularly where there were geological fault lines, they would drop into these fault lines and disappear again. Now, when I was young, I thought, I'm just cuckoo. I'm just seeing something, and my mind is doing this with an energy phenomenon, so that somehow my mind is trying to make sense of something. It's seeing some kind of archetypal energy, and what my brain is doing with what my vision is seeing is trying to make some kind of sense of it. So I just put it down to that until many, many years later. And I was very much into adulthood. It's probably less than 20 years ago, I met another dowser who could see exactly the same thing. And I thought, that's interesting then. It's not just me. Because this, I'm telling you now, I've never told anybody about this before either. So, let's just spread it all on the internet. So these things are out there, and there are other phenomena like two dumbbells with like lines coming off and circles in. I have seen these carved on stones, and they sort of flip over and come out of hills as well. So there are some really weird energy phenomena that occur at these, particularly at the esoteric events, less so than the exoteric. So you get these really weird phenomena at Imbolc, Beltane, Lammas and Samhain, less so than you get them at the exoteric events of the equinoxes and the solstices. That's much more about line movement, whereas these esoteric events are more about all this strange stuff happening. It's really interesting because Beltane particularly is associated with the time when the walls between people and spirits and fairies are at their thinnest. So Samhain, you know, it's supposed to be, it's like the festival of the dead, isn't it? The walls between the living and the dead are at their thinnest. Beltane is the walls between the living and the fairy, the spirits, the fairy folk are thought to be, you know, thinnest, and they're supposed to be thought to be in legend particularly active at this time of year, which kind of makes sense for all the woo I used to see in the landscape. Really psychedelic, and I can tell you now I hadn't taken anything, drunk anything or anything. So so it's important that, you know, we had a tradition then of leaving offerings at fairy forts and wells and other sacred places to appease the nature. And it was, you know, a time when we gathered, but we were also particularly careful about what we did in particularly in Irish mythology. You know, we didn't take fire out the grate. You didn't take water outside. You didn't. It was important that humans didn't get in the way of what fairy were doing on that night. So there's quite a lot. I suspect, you know, it's an old mythology around an awareness of what was happening in nature, because Beltane night, much as I love the day, come the evening and come after twilight, as you're going into darkness, in certain sites there's a definite sense of, we would like humans to leave now. We have stuff to be getting on with that doesn't involve you, because humans are very human centric. They think the whole universe revolves around them. The whole world revolves around humans. It's there for our disposal. We have been gifted this planet. I don't hold with that view. We share this planet with many other consciousnesses. It is not ours to do with as we want. And when other people or other beings want their time, then I would rather respect that. So yeah, so I'd say I did come on to write a blog post, but everything was getting, trying to segment it and put it in some logical order and make sense without it sounding cuckoo. So I thought I'd solve the problem and come on and do a video. It still, of course, sounds incredibly cuckoo. But that said, I say, if you want to talk to me about these energy problems, you have questions, in my group, Dowsing Masterclass on Facebook, I am going to be holding a discussion Q&A session on Friday, on the day of the solar eclipse. No, that's on Saturday, isn't it? So on Friday at 10 o'clock, this is Friday the 29th, 29th of April, I'm going to be holding a session in my Facebook group, Dowsing Masterclass. Now, for those of you who want to come into the Zoom session, to actually talk to me, face to face on Zoom, you can, and I will be giving priority to that dialogue and those questions and that discussion. If you want to, and it's a first come first served for getting in, because I've got limited capacity in that, but you can also listen to it within the Facebook group itself live. I may be able to get around to some of the questions if you post them, but I may not, because priority will be given to the people who come into the Zoom room. But it's going to be recorded and it will be posted in the group, and it will be cross-posted across my other social media platforms. So if you have any questions about all this weird and wonderful energy that we see and all the different shapes and forms that it takes, because there is a huge array of forms that is not talked about in the dowsing community. And I think honestly it's because some of it is so transient, some of it is so fast moving, that unless you can actually see it, you would never know it was there. So that's really, this is my verbal blog post about Beltane, and I would encourage you though to, bless some water, talk to the stones in your garden, do some smudging. The elementals have consciousness. Earth, air, fire and water, they have their own spirit, they have their own consciousness, and then we can break that down into various levels of the consciousness of trees, plants, flowers, but it's all on this huge spectrum of consciousness of which we are a part, of which the galaxy is a part. So these esoteric days are a really powerful time for us to try and consciously make that connection with other forms of consciousness, to expand our awareness, to expand our understanding, to open ourselves up to being more than just us. And I think for me, that kind of personal and spiritual development is incredibly important, and actually underpins my business success. Because without that personal and spiritual growth, we can't be successful. We can't become the person we need to be successful. I know for some reason people talking about success and spirituality is a clash, but I personally don't think that's the case, because when we are successful, we're living our soul's path. We're doing what for many of us who are spiritual and create a soul aligned business, we're doing something that our soul came down to achieve. And the more spiritual people we have, generating their own wealth, supporting their economies, trying to live, in an environmentally and ecologically friendly way, the better that is for us all and our planet and all the other beings that we share our space with. So that's really what I wanted to come on and say. So I've scrapped the typing, thrown that in the bin. I couldn't get my words straight. Haven't really done it justice in a video verbally either, but that's the best I can do today. So I hope you've all enjoyed this. If you've got any comments, please do leave them below. And I'll also, put the link in this spec for those of you who want to join the Zoom room with me on Friday at 10 a.m. UK time in my free Facebook group, Dowsing Masterclass, which is where we look at all things sort of earth energy, dowsing, energy in your home, and probably more beside. And I'll probably have to rename the group at some time because it won't fit. But hey ho, such is life, onwards and upwards. So I'd love to see you in the Zoom session. As I say, I've only got a limited number of people I can let into that meeting because I'm not running it as a webinar. So it is on a first come first served basis. So I'll let in who turns up at 10 o'clock. And hopefully we can have a lively debate, discussion, all about energy, consciousness, fairy folk. Because they are a level of consciousness and they imbue the landscape with all this beautiful wealth and vitality, health and vitality and abundance at this time of year. So I would love to see you in there. And yeah, that's my verbal blog post delivered. So yeah, enjoy the solar eclipse new moon on Saturday, followed by Beltane on Sunday. Throw yourself into this time of year where the eclipse is gonna, bring, if you've gone off your track of destiny, prepare for some unceremonious shunts back on. And then Beltane is all about growth and expansion, so embrace that. If you're not where you want to be, you could get an unceremonious kick up the arse to put you back where you want to be, and then that growth of energy is propelling you forward. So go with it. Don't stay stuck. Don't stay in a life that doesn't serve you. Don't surround yourself with people that don't support you. Go for it. Unashamedly, bold, brave. Energy loves speed and action, just like money does, actually. It's all energy. So embrace this weekend. It could be a huge pinnacle, a pivotal moment for you where you look back and think, that was the weekend that it all changed. Don't hold yourself back. I'll see you soon.